Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to you all, wherever you may be joining us from. My name is Shuvai Nyoni. I'm the director of the African Leadership Center, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all today to the African Leadership Center's 2021 Peter Kofi da Costa Memorial Lecture. I want to especially welcome Peter's family, Shiru, the two girls, Yasin and Jara, Mr. Alex da Costa, Peter's nephews and nieces, and other siblings. You're all very welcome. The lecture today, titled Reclaiming Kindness and Compassion as Leadership and Institutional Qualities in Post-Pandemic Africa, is significant for several reasons, but I'll just mention two. The first is that it is delivered by another great friend, mentor, supporter, collaborator, and co-conspirator of the African Leadership Center, Professor Tade Aina. Welcome, Prof. And we're very pleased to have you here today. It's also significant because of the very complex yet vital issues that the lecture promises to address. In spite of the continuing COVID pandemic that does not allow us to meet face-to-face at the ALC, we are thankful that the virtual space allows us to continue this and other legacy projects dedicated to Peter's memory, and that we launched at the inaugural lecture in 2020. Through these initiatives, the ALC will continue to honor his legacy through our dedication to the highest standards of evidence gathering for recruiting and producing change-making Africans of the next generation. It's not my job to talk for long, but I just want to outline some of the information about this webinar. The session is being recorded and will be posted on various ALC platforms, online platforms. The agenda will consist of welcome remarks by Mr. Alexander da Costa, who I will introduce in a few minutes, an introduction of the moderator and a few welcoming remarks by the chair of the African Leadership Board of Trustees, Ms. Gladwell Otieno. We will then have an introduction of our keynote speaker by Professor Fumi Oloni-Shakin, followed by the keynote lecture itself. We will then have some remarks from two discussants, Dr. Eka Ikpe and Dr. Chidi Odinkalu, and then it will be followed by a moderated session of questions and answers from other participants. We will then make a few announcements regarding the Peter da Costa legacy initiatives, and we will have a vote of thanks by another member of the Board of Trustees, Professor Karuti Kanyinga. If you wish to make a comment or ask a question, please use the question and answer icon. It is at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If you wish to be elevated to make your remarks verbally so that we can hear you, please use the raise hand function, and our colleagues who are manning the technical area of this webinar will facilitate that and allow you to speak. I think other than that, I will then move on to introduce Mr. Alex da Costa. It is my honor to invite you, Alex, to give some welcome remarks on behalf of your family. Mr. Alex da Costa is Minister Councillor and Deputy Permanent Representative of the Embassy of the Republic of the Gambia to the Swiss Confederation and the Permanent Mission of the Republic of the Gambia to the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland, so making representations for the Gambia at the World Trade Organization and other international organizations in Geneva, Switzerland. So welcome, Alex, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Shuvai, and welcome to everybody on this platform and everyone who has taken precious time to attend and recognize Peter in year 2 of his passing. First and foremost, let me extend my profound thanks to the leadership of the ALC, Professor Fumi, Shuvai, and the whole team who have been constantly working towards getting us to this day, despite our challenges with COVID-19, but also constantly ensuring that we don't forget the achievements, the recognition that they decided was due to Peter. I'd love to also welcome anyone who's on the platform for the very first time. There's a wealth of information about the work of Peter, but also the work of the African Leadership Center. As we all recognize, one of the challenges we have as Africans is leadership. Most recently, the events in Guinea raised a lot of controversy as to what leadership should be like and why coups should be prevented in Africa. Now, this is important because our economic development and stability is the most important object that we need to achieve, and development of our respective countries is key. Now, my brother was a great Pan-Africanist, albeit more of a quiet Pan-Africanist rather than a rowdy Pan-Africanist. But his interest was always in Africa progressing, and you could always tell when you had conversations with him, you know, that he was never satisfied with a lot of things that should have happened and could have happened that didn't. So a lot of his work was committed to improving this in the long term, not necessarily in the short term, by developing people and influencing people, you know, in the way they think and the way they operate, and ensuring that we also stood up shoulder by shoulder with the same colleagues of ours and our friends from the Western world who didn't have greater ability than any of us. If anything, our abilities were similar, or if not much more, but we were not really pulling our weight. So the whole lesson to learn from the ALC and the work it does, and also to learn from some of the aspirations, the thoughts, some of the intellectual arguments that my brother always demonstrated, is to ensure that our continent moves forward progressively, and we're not retarded by unnecessary issues which have challenged us. So I'll end on that note, and again, just say a formal welcome to everyone without exception. And thank you all for being here. And we do recognize that you've given up 2 hours of your time to be with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Alex, and thank you for that reminder of some of who Peter was and what he did and how he did it. And I think I really like that he was a Pan-Africanist, albeit a non-rowdy one. So thank you for that reminder. I would now like to introduce the chair of the Board of Trustees of the African Leadership Center, Ms. Gladwell Otieno. In addition to being the chair of our board, and a really amazing chair at that, Gladwell is the founder and executive director of the Africa Center for Open Governance, AFRICOG, which is a governance and anti-corruption civil society organization based in Kenya. In addition to many things that she does, I think what is important to note is that AFRICOG also convenes the Kenyans for Peace with Truth and Justice, a coalition which was founded to work for accountability for failed elections and the mass human rights abuses that followed them in 2008. And I mentioned this specifically because of some of the issues that Peter was very passionate about, and how this intersected with many other members of the Board of Trustees. In addition to chairing the ALC board, Gladwell is also a member of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime in Cape Town, Geneva, and Vienna. Gladwell, you're most welcome, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Shuvai. Thank you, Alex. Thank you to the ALC team who've worked so hard to get this going, and to the support of Hewlett Packard. And also thank you to our special guest who's going to hold the lecture. I speak in the name of the board and the whole team at ALC, the fellows and the partners. As you know, the mission of the ALC is to form a new generation of African leaders producing new thought and African-led thought in the areas of security and development and further. So as a board, we're still sort of not yet, we have not yet absorbed fully the loss of Peter. It's so often that one wants to ask him something or speak to him or exchange a little joke, and then one realizes he's not there anymore, and he's sorely missed by all of us. Peter was the intellectual engine of the board, and we sorely miss him. All the members of the board have expressed have asked me to express our continued sympathy and thoughts for the whole family of Peter, and we're very happy to hear that Shiro and Yasin and Jara are joining us today, apart from the wider family. So it'll take a long time to recover from the loss of someone like Peter, who went so tragically early. It's a huge loss, not just to the ALC, but to the African continent and to all the other contexts in which he was so active and valuable. We've all felt a particular responsibility to keep up his commitment to Pan-Africanism and to keeping up the work of the ALC and holding up the torch of the inspiration that he gave us. While he was always so modest and unassuming, he was always very, very giving of himself, his time, and his wonderful, fine mind. So as the board, we mourn his loss, but we try to continue. So in the meantime, despite the challenges of COVID, we've managed to use the advantages of technology to continue with our core activities. And we've been following with the fellowships, the training, and also with research. And in the last academic year, we've had 4 early career and women fellows from Ghana, Egypt, Kenya, and Nigeria in our center in Nairobi, who were joined by associate fellows at King's in London from Tanzania and Somalia. Some exciting research work is ongoing on the ALC's 10-year research agenda, with particular focus on the crisis in northern Nigeria, on the relationship between state and society, and very much on state capture in various African countries, and women's leadership in higher education institutions. The ALC continues to partner with various entities on issues at the nexus of policy, academia, and practice. For example, the Wilton Park Peacebuilding Conferences, which have also been continuing in 2021 and have focused on the future of peace in northern Nigeria. And we had a recent event focusing on Mozambique. So as you can see, we've tried, despite the challenges of coming to terms with the loss of Peter and also the depredations of COVID-19, we have tried to keep an active program going on. And for this, we'd like to thank the dedication of the team led by Ms. Shuvai Nyoni, the executive director, who has been indefatigable in continuing the work of the center under rather difficult conditions. I won't say much more. We're going to hear a lot more about Peter, and also we look forward to hearing the lecture, which title seems very much, resonant of the sort of person that Peter was. I'll restrict myself to introducing our next speaker, who is Professor Fumi Olonishakin, who is the Vice President, Global Engagement and Professor of Security, Leadership and Development at King's College London. Fumi is the founding member of the African Leadership Center. As I said, we aim to build the next generation of African scholars, generating cutting-edge knowledge for security and development in Africa. She was the director of the Conflict, Security and Development Group at King's, and prior to this worked in the Office of the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict. In 2015, she was appointed by then Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, as one of 7 members of the advisory group of experts on the review of the United Nations peace-building architecture. She was also a member of the advisory group of experts for the United Nations Progress Study on Youth, Peace and Security, and serves on the board of the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and chairs the African Regional Advisory Committee of the Open Society Foundation. Fumi was appointed by the University of Pretoria as an extraordinary professor in the Department of Political Sciences in 2016. And in 2016 also, the Director General of United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, invited Fumi to join the Council of the United Nations University. We're very proud to have Fumi on our board and as an inspirational figure in the African Leadership Center. And it's my honor to hand over to her.
Madam Chair.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to be taking over this baton from you and to our main program this afternoon. Let me first and foremost say that, colleagues, distinguished guests, I know that Peter's family and friends are coming together again for a second time for this second of our annual lectures, and it's a privilege to actually be chairing it this time. Thank you to Alexander da Costa for the opening remarks. And without further ado, I shall try to set a brief context for the lecture that will be presented by our eminent professor and scholar, mentor at the ALC, and collaborator, as Shuvai said, Professor Tade Akin-Aina. I want to begin to put this into context by offering an analysis of his bio, because that's the only way in which I can really explain and introduce the scholar, a leader that is about to give us a lecture this afternoon. Dr. Tade Akin-Aina, as you saw on the program, is head of research at the Mastercard Foundation, which is one of the largest private foundations in the world. And many of you would have realized that Mastercard has become really prominent on the continent of Africa at the moment. Prior to joining the Mastercard Foundation, Professor Aina served for 6 years as the executive director of the Partnership for African Social and Governance Research, which many of you know as PASGA in Kenya. It's an independent, non-partisan, Pan-African, not-for-profit organization in Kenya. Prior to this period, he was program director of higher education and libraries in Africa for the Carnegie Corporation of New York in the US from 2008 to 2014. I hope you're noting the kind of trajectory that is being formed in his bio, because I would like to make particular remarks about this. Over the course of his career, Dr. Aina had, he has consulted for numerous multilateral agencies, including UNDP, UNICEF, UN Habitat, the United Nations University, and the World Bank on issues ranging from urbanization, urban poverty to governance, to social, educational, public health, and environmental issues such as higher education reform, nutrition, child development, environment, and development. You can already guess what his academic background is, and I would mention that in a short statement just now. But he's a founding member and member of the Board of Trustees of the Nigerian Environmental Study Team, known as NEST, and founder of the Lagos Group for the Study of Human Settlements. He has been a member of boards, including Trust Africa in Dakar, Senegal, the African Population Health Center, IPHRC, the Council of the United States International University in Africa, USIU Africa, the Kenya Human Rights Commission, the Seeding Labs USA, Winrock International, USA, King Badoan Foundation, USA, the Council of Management of the African Books Collective. And I could just name all the various institutions and organizations that he has offered his not just mentorship, intellectual capacity to over the past several decades. But appointed full professor in Department of Sociology at the University of Lagos, he later served as Deputy Executive Secretary for Publications in Codesria, in Senegal as well. He worked with the Ford Foundation in the Nairobi office from 1998 to 2008, which interestingly, it was during this period before he left Ford Nairobi that I first had the privilege of meeting him. And this is where he was regional representative for 5 years from 2003 to 2008, an acting representative for a short period between 2001 and 2002 in the Cairo office. I cannot begin to, read out the numbers of publications that he has authored. As I said earlier, a full professor before he began to connect the dots across many global issues and in different parts of the world. He has authored and co-edited a number of books and monographs, more than a dozen, more than 3 dozen books, book chapters, more than 2 dozen articles in journals and learned publications. He has edited several publications. He has served on advisory boards. I wanted to read this extensively because when a global African is moving around spaces and not just speaking, but working in different ways, part of what we do not do is document the history of the impact that those global Africans are making in their different spaces. As someone with the kind of academic background that Professor Aina has, with the intellectual capacity to affect various spaces between academia, you see the activist academic networks, and that's how I choose to define an eminent body like Codesria and what it does on the continent when it comes to linking social science to change at this moment in the world and for several decades before now. Now, Professor Aina's trajectory closes the loop for someone like me who has always argued that the best way to impact one's world is to produce knowledge, adapt the outputs, the products of that knowledge to affect multiple spaces. If you can all at once, which many of us cannot do at once, you must try to affect it both through voluntary contributions as well as proper engagement. And when I read, anytime I read Professor Aina's biography, I see the ways in which he has navigated several terrains and connected dots for us from not-for-profit type activities, his own personal engagement, mentoring people in different spaces, sitting on boards, philanthropy to really fund some of the initiatives that he cares about, but that he thinks will change the world. And finally, the production of the knowledge across those spaces in the ways in which he distributes that knowledge. I wanted to carefully do that because as I read his bio, again, I had the privilege of reading it a few years back. As I read it again in the last couple of days, I realized that he has completed his own personal history and the history of the impact that he has made in our world in different spaces. And we do not usually document the achievements of individuals like this in their lifetime. And my hope is that in the ways that we've started at the ALC, we begin to reward the contributions of such individuals by carefully documenting their mentoring experience. This program, this particular lecture is one of those. Madam Chair, I'm sorry that I took that long to introduce our keynote speaker. It's a very special moment for us at a time that we are beginning to show that the Peter da Costa Memorial Lectures will become an annual event for us at the ALC and not a one-off event. The knowledge that will be produced through such through this particular history that we're building, but the kinds of individuals that come to give lectures here will really show that we're dedicated to those legacies that Peter da Costa left us with, and which we'll build upon, with a lot of energy and effort. So without further ado, permit me to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Omotade Akinyaina. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fumi Olonishaki, my Aburo, as I fondly call you. Miss Gladwell Otieno, Madam Chair, the Chair of the ALC Board of Trustees, the family of Peter da Costa, Mrs. Chiru da Costa and the two daughters, Your Excellency Alexander da Costa, and all other members of the family present, trustees of ALC, Shuvai, the director of ALC, management staff, alumni, fellows of ALC, colleagues from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, fellow students, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and warm greetings wherever you may be joining us from. A memorial lecture is a special occasion. It is both a moment of celebration and sober reflection of the life, memory, vision, dreams, ideals, and aspirations of a special and distinguished departed one, who, when they lived, gave the world and the rest of us the gift of their persons, vision, resources, ideas, and hope, and thereby made a difference to our humanity. The one we are all here for today is dedicated to the memory and life of our friend, colleague, mentor, Pan-Africanist, and generous and kind human being and leader, Dr. Peter da Costa. I join Madam Chair in expressing the loss that Peter's departure continues to be for some of us. He's the kind of person in this moment of lockdown, this moment of the COVID pandemic, that I will have spent time calling and speaking to for hours in terms of making sense and making meaning of what is going on in the world today. We have come to celebrate his life and vision, and we have come to reflect on issues and ideas that he cherished. So giving this lecture is an opportunity for me to continue to pay my respect to his life, work, and times. The principles Peter stood for, the values he enshrined, his friendship and his stewardship, and to collectively reflect with you and explore an aspect of his life's work. And that's why I have chosen the topic of this lecture as reclaiming kindness and compassion as leadership and institutional qualities in post-pandemic Africa. This is because it connects with Peter as a lovable, friendly human being, strong in his kindness and compassion and empathy, but very clear-headed about what he considers to be the future and the principles for Africa, which was why, along with the trustees and the fellows of African Leadership Center and the staff and management, he contributed to shaping the intellectual discourse and the trajectory and vision of this great center. It is an accepted fact today that the COVID-19 pandemic is a significant, unique, perhaps one in a lifetime occurrence of tremendous disruption, economic and human loss, and downturn in living conditions, lifestyles, and well-being of many of us in the world today. It has also occurred in what one can call a perfect storm of widespread crises and incidents that includes not only economic downturns, civic unrest. We know the EndSARS movement in Nigeria, the various other movements that have occurred throughout the world, the Jaune Gilet, and the Black Lives Matter. So, what I call a perfect storm of widespread crises and incidents that include political strife, and let us not forget ecological and climate crises and disasters, such as the unprecedented or massive wildfires across different parts of the world, earthquakes, severe hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and and other pest invasions in Eastern Africa and parts of Africa. We have, as a result, seen the accentuation of inequality across the board, the growth of the marginalization of significant proportions of humanity. And we can see that with the problem with the vaccine inequality that we are all going through. And at the same time, the attack and the erosion of human and people's rights and dignity. At the same time, for a minority in the world, corporate and individual wealth has grown significantly. Privilege has expanded, and life chances and opportunities have improved in unprecedented ways. We have also seen the growth of individual and collective resentment, the radicalization of prejudice, and the conversion of many people's frustrations, anger, despair, and pain into toxic politics of hate, cruelty, and exclusion. If anything, our present time has demonstrated how fragile and vulnerable our political and economic models and the civic, moral, and social structures that most nations of the modern contemporary world operate with. It is indeed as if the victories of human civilization that we won with the end of slavery, political decolonization, the rise of human and civil rights, and the gains of the feminist, anti-racist, sexuality and reproductive rights struggles are not only being eroded, but are being reversed. This complex articulation of crises and disasters, the degradation of human dignity, and the reversal of our human rights and democratic gains provide a unique opportunity to rethink, reimagine, regroup, rebuild, reinvent, and co-create based on the principles of respect for human dignity and life, the sustainability of our pluriverse, and I call it our pluriverse, not our universe, and our individual and collective will to reclaim and transform our world, our lives, and our humanity. Yes, indeed, another world is possible, and a better world is possible. It is an opportunity for new forms of ethical stewardship and leadership, and to reclaim the values, actions, and imperatives of compassion and kindness in our leadership, in our personal lives, and in our institutions. These are the memories I have of Peter da Costa. And that's why we are zeroing in on kindness and compassion. The question many will ask is, why kindness and compassion? Why not other values, principles, and emotions? I want to argue that first and foremost, these are fundamental and primordial human emotions and qualities that exist in all human communities. It's part of what makes us human. They form the basis of and coexist and are coterminous with empathy. We will not delay ourselves with definitions and conceptual clarifications here. Jamil Zaki, the Stanford psychologist and professor, in his 2019 book, The War for Kindness, has provided us with extensive details of the intellectual history, the nuances, and the practical and empirical manifestations of these three interrelated notions. Compassion and kindness relate more to acts and actions, while empathy deals with the ability to recognize the emotional and other situations and conditions of others. It is taking the part of the other. It is being in the shoes of the other, being in the selves of the other. It may lead or not lead to action, but it is an important element of compassion and kindness. Zaki and other students of this phenomenon have shown how kindness, compassion, and empathy undergird the instincts, the values, the virtues, and the motivation that drive our yearnings, actions, and struggles for meaningful lives, for justice, for equality, equity, liberty, and the definition and enactment of entitlements and rights. These notions embody the constitution of our dignity, the respect for self and the other, and decency. When translated into our institutions and cultures, they are often the basis for norms, values, and laws. Also, it is important to note that in a world with a long history of individual, collective, and institutionalized cruelty, expressed in brutal repression, domination, and exploitation, the importance of a renewal and reclamation of compassion and kindness in our personal, private, and public settings cannot but be emphasized. We're talking of cruelty expressed in lynching, in torture, in mass incarceration, in ethnic cleansing, in gender-based violence, in femicide, and in genocide. As Africans, large-scale institutional and institutionalized cruelty remain too fresh in our memories. We remember the repression of colonization and apartheid. We know what happened in the Congo. Hushield, 1998. Mikellarong, 2004. And have documented this effectively. And we know what happened in Kenya itself. What happened with the Mau Mau revolution and the brutal repression, which Anderson in 2005 and Elkins in 2005 have effectively documented. And indeed, institutional cruelty remains present, palpable in our contemporary societies. From the toxic politics of cruelty that Adam Seward describes in a contemporary American society in the 2021 book, The Cruelty is the Point, the past, present, and future of Trump's America, to the actions of militant extremists and the imposition of various forms of outdated and irrelevant religious fundamentalist political orders and regimes in many of our societies. In this era of growing toxic politics of cruelty, the need to mobilize and build leadership, movements, coalitions, and constituencies of compassion, empathy, and kindness becomes important. But as studies have shown, compassion, empathy, and kindness are not just mushy, sentimental exuding of feelings and nice emotions. They have concrete benefits for society, for individual and collective well-being, and for social solidarity. We have seen that in this moment of the pandemic. Compassion, empathy, and kindness have been identified as significant aspects of our evolutionary survival, adaptation, and thriving toolkit as human species. And today they are becoming a major area of research in recent times, not only in psychology and social psychology, but also in sociology, in business, in neurosciences, in history, and a host of other disciplines. According to Claudia Hammond, 2021, kindness might once have been considered something of a soft topic, but it has begun to be taken seriously within academic research. When developmental psychologist Robin Banerjee surveyed past research, he found just 35 papers on kindness in psychology journals in the whole of the 1980s. In the past decade, there have been more than 1,000. The Stanford University psychologist Jamil Zaki's 2019 book, and it's a rigorous but accessible book called The War for Kindness, Building Empathy in a Fractured World, Broadway Books, on the subject matter with an immense coverage and grasp of the literature also demonstrates this. And of course, the current work of the Australian social psychologist on the kindness, Hugh Mackay, on the kindness revolution. All of these have brought kindness back as a scholarly enterprise and project. And they have begun, like Hugh Mackey said, to show how the kindness dial has shifted from the rampant individualism of years of neoliberalism towards a more cooperative and kind society generated by the conflicts and the crisis that we are undergoing. Perhaps the key lesson from the literature is that kindness, empathy, and compassion are not fixed categories. They operate on a continuum based on a combination of biology and genes, contexts, and experiences. They can be learned and taught in various degrees. And that the dial of this continuum can be moved through awareness, intentionality, training, reinforcement, and other social and political incentives. And it's interesting because, if you look at Buddhist monks for whom compassion is work, the element of intentionality and deliberate engagement is important. In other words, we all have the capacity for empathy, compassion, and kindness. We can sharpen these capacities and be deliberate and intentional about them in our personal, professional, and public lives. We can also institutionalize elements of kind, compassionate, and empathic behaviors as part of our organizational and political cultures. As I shall point out later, this is becoming part of, in fact, the corporate, customer, and human capital relations in some organizations. Interesting that the private sector is actually beginning to internalize and institutionalize this. Also, we are beginning to see studies and reports of the importance of kindness and compassion in public leadership. People try to make a comparison between the public leadership of Angela Merkel and some other people that we know who are leaders or have been leaders of the Western world, and also the contemporary experience of the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, who has a YouTube speech in which she stated that she wants the government to bring kindness back. Talking about Jacinda Ardern brings us to the question of leadership and how it relates to kindness. A new kind of alternative leadership grounded in the vision of young Africans as agents of transformative, sustainable, and enduring change, both in people's lives and in society and politics, and particularly in peace, security, and development, is, in my understanding, a paraphrase of what the idea of the African Leadership Center stands for. It is a leadership made to serve. It is non-hierarchical, mission-driven, problem-solving, creative and innovative, and connected to individuals and communities. It is a leadership enabled with the capacities for peace-building, conflict resolution, development, that is inclusive development and social justice. It is and seeks inclusivity across all identities. It is committed to equity and social justice, and it seeks action across all sectors of our lives. This leadership has an approach that attempts to build bridges across difference, diversity, and ingrained prejudice. So we are definitely at home in this space created by the African Leadership Center. For this alternative leadership to work, however, either in business, in society, in peace and security and development, it must embody empathy. It must embody compassion. It must embody kindness. This is a radical empathy and compassion that moves us beyond mere feelings and connections to an intentional and sustained call to action and change. This is a radical active empathy, not a passive empathy, and a set of actions that meets the others where they are. It is not judgmental. It is not condemnatory. It is not abusive, but it is willing and ready to accompany those who need to and want to change. It is also empathy, compassion, and kindness that does not condone prejudice. It does not condone cruelty and unkindness, but works to shift the dial of values and actions away from them. This, what I call radical empathy compassion, and kindness is not about a mechanistic affirmation of social justice or revolution that replaces the one terrain of cruelty with its own gulags and all forms of breaches of human dignity and rights. Some of us have lived long enough to see revolutions that came on behalf of ordinary people and of the workers and of poor people, of peasants, but have been transformed into instruments of oppression, exploitation, and aggression and attack on human dignity and human choice and human rights. We have seen that in the course of the past 70 years of human history. From the Second World War, massive changes have occurred that we have seen. I must also point out that the literature on leadership is also massive. Some, like McGuzzon's 2006, in Leading Through Conflict, emphasize different values from the traditional corporate leadership and values of Western capitalism. Leadership is not conquest. Leadership is not domination. Leadership is not imposition. Leadership is not a mythical, male, masculinist, patriarchal demonstration of strength that lacks vulnerability, that lacks empathy, that lacks recognition. We have also seen the works of other people like C. Michael Thompson in 2000 in the book The Congruent Life, emphasizing the spiritual and contemplative values and actions of leadership. Most of the literature believe and also do our business schools today, and that's interesting. I'm not sure whether it's about transaction or the bottom line, but we can see private enterprise and business schools actually coming into this conversation and this discourse around the cultures of leadership. And they all believe that leadership is intentional, it is deliberate, and can be taught and learned. So let us connect the two. Kindness, compassion, and empathy are intentional. They are deliberate. They can be taught. They can be learned. So can leadership be taught and be learned. And transformative and alternative leadership, because that's the experience of the ALC in terms of the training that our fellows and our colleagues are getting in this contest. So kindness, compassion, and empathy are not in tension with effectiveness. They're not in tension with delivering social, public, and economic good, as long as our institutional goals are transformative and non-exploitative and non-extractive. It's not surprising that Grosbech and Satijini 2020 have published in the Harvard Business Review, that is the business review of the Harvard Business School, an article on how good leadership is an act of kindness. Another interesting point is the grounding of these notions, these three notions, in indigenous knowledge and learning from alternative knowledge systems, such as the African notion of Ubuntu, the African notion of Omoluabi, and several notions that reside in our traditional cultures. This also brings me to empathy as methodology and an epistemological entry point. And it takes me back to my sociological training. Max Weber, in the methodology known as Verstehen, referred to Verstehen as empathy, that is the subjective understanding of the situation and condition of the other. A lot of ethnographic methods and anthropological methods also claim empathy. But my position from the perspective of a decolonized research methods is that it is beyond Verstehen and ethnography. It is about the non-extractive, reciprocal, restitutive, and collaborative nature and process of knowledge production, and knowledge utilization. So we can see that empathy, compassion, and kindness transcend not only leadership itself, but even the production and co-production and dissemination and utilization of knowledge itself. reside and can be seen to have grounding in these notions. Back to Ubuntu. We see this African way of living that emphasizes collaboration, cooperation, reciprocity, and solidarity, not in a mere material transactional mode, but more in terms of complementarity and empathy. Ubuntu values and practices are being incorporated again into business and development interventions. You can see that in the works of Mungi Ngomane 2020, London and Nelson 2010, and Matabane in 2018. Let us move from the personal to the institutional, because it is possible that we all consider that these values, these characteristics and virtues are only personal. But they are institutional, because that's where we can make the connection for transformative change. That's where we can make the connection for action, for mobilization. Reclaiming kindness and compassion as leadership qualities have institutional dimensions. We already have organizations that have incorporated kindness in the sense of values and behaviors that emphasize listening, respect, and inclusivity as basis for interventions, organizational development, partnerships, and operations. For instance, the institution that I work with and work in now, the MasterCard Foundation, does this. Is integrated kindness as an essential, kindness and respect and listening as an essential value of his operation and engagement. The African Leadership Center was also built on these principles, and there are several other organizations that are focused in terms of their interactions, their personal service, their goal orientation in doing this. But before we talk about this movement from the personal to the collective, to the institutional, we have talked about a post-pandemic world. We can only speculate, but we have seen the signals of what kind of post-pandemic Africa we are already beginning to see emerge. It is going to be a challenging terrain, and yet it's going to be a terrain of opportunities, a terrain that is going to be dependent and driven by the youthful population of Africa. We're going to be faced with tough choices on the creation of dignified and fulfilling work for millions of young people. We'll be faced with the provision of broken services and infrastructures. We'll be faced with addressing new technologies and the fact that we are entering the pandemic, and the lockdown did not stop the advance of the fourth industrial revolution. The world of artificial intelligence, of machine learning. In fact, more than anything else, the pandemic kicked us into this brave new world. The world of startups, technological startups. The world of a different kind of literacy, digital literacy, digital relations of production, digital relations of domination and oppression, digital, in fact, a world in which the algorithms include the algorithms of oppression, not only the algorithms of emancipation. It is that kind of world that we are going to enter. It is that kind of world that we are going to have to build social movements in. It is that kind of world that we're going to build practices. We're going to model new forms of behavior, new forms of practices, new forms of leadership, by example. And it is that kind of world that young people, whether we like it or not, will be in charge and will be leaders. We need to work and build a new and more relevant leadership. We need to understand and work for the integration of compassion, kindness, and empathy, so that we do not build empty shells and an empty shell and mechanistic social structures that claim liberation, that claim emancipation, and yet have no human content and human touch. In closing, Rather than posing the questions in terms of scaling up, which is the question that people in development interventions tend to pose, I would like to close by asking, how do we build movements? How do we build coalitions and constituencies for transformed societies and transformed lives? Through kind, compassionate, and empathetic leadership and stewardship. My knowledge and relationship with Peter da Costa, and I need to say, many people do not know, but I think Fumi does. My last job at the Partnership for African and Social and Governance Research, PASGA, was actually instigated by Peter da Costa and another good colleague and friend, Ambassador Judith Bahemuka. Peter had been part of the evaluation of PASGA in, I think, 2012 and 13. And Peter was one of the first people to reach out to me to say, Tadi, this is going. I think this is an opportunity to come and help make a difference on the continent. Come, give this a shot. And that's how I found myself in Kenya for another 6 years. My knowledge of Peter convinces me that this was a part of his vision and social project. There are many pathways for us to do this. And as we come together in the spirit of Ubuntu to uncover and discover those pathways together across disciplines, across professions, across contexts and sectors and struggles, we will be adding our own contributions to the work that Peter da Costa began, lived for, and has handed the baton over to us. Thank you very much.
Professor Tadia, I thought that was a tour de force. I didn't, I didn't expect anything less than what you have just done. Thank you so very, very much for connecting so many dots in that process. But can I just first and foremost say to our participants, you would have noticed that somehow we were Zoom bombed in the course of this presentation, in the course of the lecture. We have disabled the chats. And at the moment, the message, my colleagues are asking me to send you a message. Please do not click on any of the links in the chat. Please do not click on those links. They're working to remove the various chats that came in during that period. Many apologies for that. We have disabled the chats, but Q&A is still working. But if we return to what Shuvai suggested earlier, that you use the raise hand facility. If you use the raise hand facility, we will locate you and you will have a chance to ask your question or to offer your comments. Thank you very much. Prof, thank you. Whilst you take a break from that that lecture that offered us some both insight and foresight, whilst you take a break from it, I want to call on two colleagues to offer us some comments, to respond in a sense to what they have just heard. The first person to speak will be Dr. Eka Ipe, who I'm pleased to say, we have not done that announcement yet, is the head of the African Leadership Center in Nairobi, Associate Professor Reader at the African Leadership Center. Eka, over to you first. After that, we'll be joined by Dr. Chidi Odinkalu in a moment. Thank you so much. Eka,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you so much to all those who have spoken before me. Prof, I know that was an amazing lecture. I hope I'm able to respond to it. I think I was just so enamored with all that you were saying. So thanks very much also to colleagues for inviting me to do this. I wanted to start by reflecting a little bit on bits of what had been said today. Mr. Alex da Costa had spoken in his remarks about Peter, our dear friend, our dear leader. He made some comments about Peter that really led me to reflect on, how I've seen Peter, I've experienced him, and how many of my colleagues have as well. The use of the term non-rowdy, when he used that, that was really so apt in describing Peter. What the other thing that was very apt about that was how Peter was non-rowdy without making the rest of us that were super rowdy feel bad about our rowdiness. I think this was such an amazing feat of his to be able to manage that. The point about his Pan-Africanism, how he was a Pan-Africanist, but a pluralist in that regard. So giving space and room for a lot of people to sort of experience and explore their Pan-Africanism in a whole range of ways. There was always a sense that there was space for everyone in our encounters with Peter. The point about being an inspiration. So, Adeoti, are you trying to say something? Apologies. Okay. Sorry about that. The point about Peter being an inspiration, of course, I think it goes without saying, to colleagues, to students, to his mentees, and we heard a lot from family and friends. And then the final point I wanted to draw upon, there's so many points one could draw upon, but the point that was made about Peter as an intellectual, and I think it resonated a great deal with me, especially when we think about how Stuart Hall makes a distinction between academic work and intellectual work. How it didn't matter what space Peter was in, he was always an intellectual, but as an intellectual, engaging with everyone. He didn't treat his, his intellectual aptitude as something lofty, but gave all of us access to that. So I thought it was important to just share those reflections. Do bear with me. So now to Prof. Aino's amazing talk. I think, what he said about how this is a very pertinent time to be having this conversation about kindness and empathy and the interactions that could, should, perhaps has had with leadership, but certainly ought to have with leadership. I think it's incredibly pertinent, the points he made about inequity and how privilege has actually expanded in the midst of sort of desperate degradation. And we continue to see the evolution of this inequity. When we think there's a solution, we see the inequity even in those solutions as well. I think this is so telling of the world, the globe that we find ourselves in. The point was about how fragile and vulnerable our models are. In a sense, the vulnerability of these structures that we've relied on and treated as though they were sacrosanct, seeing those fall apart. But the extent to which we are able to admit that they're falling apart is a case in point. I mean, there are always explanations given, to why these are not working. And quite often those explanations fail to just accept that they are fallible. These models and these ways of knowing are fallible, and we have to rethink them. But a lot has been bet on this system. So accepting that they're fallible is not a very easy place to come to. The point he makes about this being an opportunity to regroup, to reinvent and co-create is very well taken. Talking about new forms of ethical stewardship, for instance. And so what he said about why this theme and this conversation about kindness, I really thought that was so poignant, that this exists in all human communities and is fundamental to our humanness. I like what he said also about how we ought not to delay ourselves with conceptual and theoretical clarifications. And I was inspired actually by the title of this lecture. I decided to look to poets to see what they think about this most human of characteristics. And I'll reflect on a little bit of that in my comments here. I think the point that was made about the fundamental nature of kindness being the respect for self and other is again a very foundational point for us to think about when we come into this space. This idea of how the self and other are interdependent in the truest, most basic sense, I think has to be critical to any conversation that we're coming to on this. And the point about how, what would happen? What happens when we think of kindness as the basis for norms and values? Especially when we're in a moment where we've seen individual and collective cruelty. I really appreciated that historical look at that, but especially thinking of this COVID moment. What happens there? And what is called to my mind is the work of Naomi Shihab Nye, where she says, before you know, in a poem titled Kindness, before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. She says also how desolate the landscape can be when we're thinking about kindness. And so for me, it makes it all the more poignant that we should be thinking of rebuilding in the midst of the challenges and the difficulty that we found. We should be thinking of rebuilding with kindness in mind. And that's a lesson I'm drawing from her here. The point is also made about the concrete benefits of kindness. This is not a wishy-washy theme. It's not a soft skill as is often presented, but we can think of how the pandemic itself has shown us the benefits of kindness and how important this has to be for the evolution of human society. So when it also called to mind for me some of the references that Prof. Aino made to global development policy, for instance, that what would happen, a key theme I'm often concerned with, many of my colleagues here will recognize it. If we think of neoliberalism, even in its crudest sense, I really don't also want to be bogged down by conceptualizing and the conceptual explanations and theoretical explanations or understanding of neoliberalism. But if we think of it even in its crudest sense, if we see a conversation between neoliberalism and kindness, what would they say to each other? I think in this space of learning from poets, I'm bringing this sort of lens to this and thinking about how neoliberalism has served a role in flattening the complexity of human society. And in a sense, what Claude Ake spoke about in terms of the dynamic character of reality and how that makes nonsense of a lot of the assumptions that neoliberalism has been wrought upon. And in spite of that, how policies are rolled out and continually rolled out that have no empirical rooting that is relevant to the societies that they're supposed to be engaging with. And so for me, this is a very real way of thinking about the importance, the significance of kindness and what would happen if we centered kindness in what we were trying to do. I loved what Prof said also about how leadership, we have to think of leadership as being made to serve, the reference to the ALC here, leadership as non-hierarchical, as an approach that's about trying to build bridges across communities. And I think of within the ALC, the commitments to do this across generations, for instance, really centering intergenerational exchanges. But I loved what was said about being able to think about kindness as being active, as being intentional as well. Because leadership is not about conquest, it's not mythical. And when we begin to think of that interaction between leadership and kindness, it really, I think, makes very clear how leadership cannot be about conquest. It's not mythical. It's not about the demonstration of strength that lacks vulnerability, right? And I think this is very critical. It's very important. We have to be thinking about how it is not abusive as well. And this calls to mind for me the work of another poet, Youssef Komunyakaa, where he questions how might we be able to measure kindness? Do we measure with a barometer, with a temperature gauge, with a ruler? How would we measure kindness? And this is a question I guess we come to when we want to embark or move into this space where we really take seriously this call to center kindness in what we do, right? So while we're trying to figure that out, Youssef is also quite clear that while we think about how we measure kindness, we also know when there is kindness. So I take his words again, where he says, we know the moment kind-heartedness walks in. He says, your knowing gaze enters a room and opens the day. Even the bedazzled brute knows when sunlight falls through the leaves. So I think this is to say again that while we are intellectuals doing intellectual work, prioritizing that over academic work, we mustn't get lost in semantics. We have to be thinking about our knowledge systems and how we're contributing to knowledge about this. A lot of that, Professor Aino referenced. So I'm not saying we put that to one side, but as we continue to build on that and we contribute to that, people know when there's kindness in the room. And so we mustn't be distracted by that. We should move with doing the work. We should move with being intentional about this. And yes, I mean, I think those were the key points I wanted to raise here. Thank you very much for giving me the space to have been able to reflect on this here. Thank you so much for that lecture, Prof, as well.
Eka, you know, Professor, I now said so much about this intergenerational work at the ALC. I think if Peter were here today and was listening to you responding to a senior mentor in the way that you just did, and saw the dialogue going on between your presentations, and saw the interdisciplinary exchanges, a sociologist talking to a development economist, one using the lens of humanities to really explicate the key, messages today, and the other retreating to poetry and intersecting in such elegant ways. Peter will be proud indeed with all of the knowledge he's had of you for the past decade or so. Thank you so very, very kindly to both of you. And Eka, we will come back in question time, and I see that questions are building. And without further ado, I want to call on Chidi Odinkalu, who's here with us. He needs no introduction. He has his own personal story, and relationship with Peter da Costa. He, as many of you know, has for many years headed the Open Society Justice Initiative in Nigeria, but I'm proud to say that in the last few months, he's been appointed Professor of Practice at the Fletcher School of Law. And Chidi's intellectual elegance tells me that he would just really be disrupting the spaces that he goes to there. And it will be a privilege to have him with us at King's at different moments at various sessions with our fellows, but with students at the African Leadership Center. Eka, since it's you and Shuvai who are running the show now, I'm sure the two of you will be speaking to Chidi soon. So Chidi, over to you for your own comments too. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, my my august sister, Professor Olonishaki. That's the only way to put it, august sister. But thank you even more to the ALC for this session, and it's really a delight to see my original Egmont, Professor Aina, and to listen at least to the part that I heard. Not that I'm surprised at all. It's just that I'm challenged in my and he shows up my own constraints. Listening to such profundity, first from Onku, and next from Eka, I don't want to try and belabor too many issues. It's development and speaking to the humanities. I want to try and make my own response a bit experiential. Milan Kundera in the Book of Laughter and Forgetting has this very memorable passage. And I'll quote him, "He made love to me like an intellectual." The thing about a lack of empathy and kindness and compassion in life as a toolbox of virtues is that it can make even the most wonderful of experiences very hurtful and very lacking in worth and affirmation. And that's really what made Peter such a unique person. He brought he brought a unique toolbox of virtues to everything he did. Peter introduced me to the woman who would become my wife. That was actually how we met in Banjul about 30 years ago. And it was on our second meeting, I was like, hey, Chidi, come, do you know this sister? And that was how it started. It's interesting when you look back at it, because the location was a place called Rude Boys. And even in Rude Boys, Peter found a way to bring kindness to it. Obviously, none of us knew how we were going to get bound up together in so many other ways. On that day, none of us knew what would follow. But just his commitment to, look, here is another sister doing things that you're interested in, that you need to know of, was one thing that you could never take away from Peter. It came naturally to him, like eating, like breathing. And that's really the angle I want to come at this from, because the subject matter is so bound up with who Peter was and what his virtues were and what his legacies are, that I don't want to tie it to a post-pandemic world. This is really a timeless conversation. But it's also the fact that, Professor Aino says so many things. He talked about how kindness can be taught. They can be learned. There can be, people can be skilled up as well. And it reminds me that these are not just virtues up there somewhere in the sky. They're civic virtues. Kindness and so I don't want to, there's so much that's been talked about literature and Ubuntu and all of that, but these are civic virtues. I come from a small country in West Africa called the United Democratic Republic of Nigeria. And it has this little pamphlet called the Constitution. The shortest provision in the Nigerian Constitution, bar none, is section 17(2)(b) of the Constitution. It reads, you don't even have to read it, governmental actions shall be humane. Let me repeat myself. Most Nigerians have never heard that this is actually in their constitution. That's the fantastic thing about it. Governmental actions shall be humane. And the day I cited this to them in the presidency to tell them why they should stop the police from shooting us, because we were demonstrating about people who had been killed and calling attention to the need for the government to do something about it, they nearly fell off their chairs. They did not believe that I was citing a constitutional provision in Nigeria. And it's been useful in trying to persuade all manner of people who didn't know it existed that they actually have to make an effort to try and observe it. And that's my way of saying that we need to make civic governance and constitutional virtues of this, and then see how we habituate our people, our citizens, our institutions, and our politicians to those civic virtues. Because when you do that, it means you are not going to allow the police to torture your citizens and your people. It means that you're not going to shoot your citizens just because they are protesting and you don't like the fact that they have the gumption to protest. It means that you are going to care about what the children do when they get into school. You're going to care about whether or not children are in school. That means you're going to care about whether or not you build schools. And therefore, you're going to care about making sure that you don't have out-of-school children. Those are not just to be done because, well, schools should be built. They should be done because kindness and compassion and empathy should be high constitutional virtue. And I say this because this is a leadership center, and we are talking about this in the context of leadership and in the context of memorializing a man who embodied the best virtues of leadership, even though he did not occupy any office, any public office, or indeed any office, public or private. And it also means that that we should be looking at this in terms of self-interest. It's useful to talk about them in terms of theological virtues, but no, and philosophical ideals. No, these actually should also be reflected in the realism that underpins governmental and leadership action in our places. It therefore means that we should see building hospitals as essential to our existence. We should see to it that no African woman has to give birth and die doing so because there are no birth attendants. It means that we can make investments, the investments we need to uplift dignity in our people, which is the other thing, that when you embody that trinity of kindness and compassion and empathy in leadership virtues, you build a dignitarian society, which, as South Africa's former Chief Justice Arthur Chaskalson said, has to be the basis of any constitutional system, a dignitarian foundation. How do you construct that dignitarian foundation? It's got to be built on constitutional virtues that embody this trinity. And as Professor Aino has pointed out, you find that trinity in much of African cosmology. You can go into whichever part of it, but that trinity of dignity, of empathy, compassion, and kindness is there in many of our societies. In my part of the world, my grandfather was the person who taught me about this. And you say, when you treat people with kindness and compassion and empathy, and he was speaking in Igbo, my maternal grandfather. This is the lesson, if you ask my children, they will always tell you. And this is what he said, that when you treat people with dignity, with compassion and empathy and kindness, the compassion you have shown them is your shield. And the empathy you show them is your sword. Whenever they want to do anything against you, they will never succeed, because if the empathy you have shown them does not attack them, the compassion you have shown them will protect you. Let me repeat myself, and this is where the self-interest comes in. If the empathy you have shown them will not attack them, the compassion you have shown them will protect you. For those who think that these virtues are there, are some abstract concepts in the air, for us to while away time in academic conversations, that is not the case. Our ancestors in our continent believed in them, and it made a lot of them much happier in life and in their hereafter. And part of our problem in contemporary African society is that we have failed to imbibe those as we've transitioned from the familiar society to the anonymous society. And the accountability mechanisms that come with that, with the society, the traditional society, were lost. And so we've not been able to transition them into mechanisms that have indicators of performance. And that is where, therefore, we've got to think about investments in science that advance our society, investments in education, in knowledge management, investments in the kinds of things that Professor Aino spoke about, which ultimately are well-grounded in African cosmology, but also in these trinity of virtues as constitutional values, high constitutional values, by the way, and also high civic values. Thank you very much for honoring Peter, and may you also be honored in your lifetimes and hereafter. Thank you.
Thank you so much. the professors that I have around this virtual table today have really shown us how it's done. The professor in the making and the established ones. And this is actually how it should be. And I cannot thank you enough. We have a few questions, and I see that Twitter is going in so many different directions. I'm going to keep my eyes on the questions that we have, because in a sense, the conversation among the three of you, seems to be responding already to some of these questions. Prof, I know. Dr. Angela Murithi from Plan International says, thank you so much for the very interesting lecture. I will need to listen to it again, and you will, Angela, because we will make sure that it is online. She says, kindness, compassion, and empathy is a key tenet of feminist leadership. So your points are very well taken. Many organizations are trying to encourage feminist leadership as a work culture. You mentioned that these behaviors can be learned. Can you talk us through how we do this in an increasingly cutthroat, competitive, neoliberal global economic system? And also, what are your thoughts about kindness and the climate change emergency that we're facing? I mean, these are big questions. I think it's just to really, help our reflection as we go on. I think in a sense, Eka was saying, what will neoliberalism and kindness say to each other? I noted that. So we're pathway to on the pathway to answering this question. But let me put that solidly on the table, Prof, for you to respond to. But I'm sure Eka and Chidi can also elaborate on it. But whilst we're there, let me mention the other two questions that I have here, which are quite short. Can a world with limited or actually no kindness and empathy during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic regain kindness and empathy in the post-pandemic world? Very, very profound. And the last one is, how can Africa leverage on kindness to deal with the challenge of the COVID-19 vaccine inequality? Prof, you mentioned this in your lecture as well. And I think that there's a lot of food for thought here. These questions are raising a lot of, I find them challenging because in a sense, as Chidi was saying, Africa was was very much in a position to leverage its own communal agency and use, if you like, inbuilt approaches such as kindness, empathy, and compassion. And somehow along the way, it seems as if our space has been hijacked in a sense by the values of neoliberalism, but also some of the very ugly aspects of human interaction, some of which you mentioned earlier. And so how do we move from where we are now? But let me lay that bare and hope that Prof, you can, Prof, now you can start, and then I ask our colleagues. I see that there's a hand up, and there's a hand up from Joseph Atam Mensah. If you just allow me quickly, please, we'll bring Joseph in to add to this question so that you can do some collective reflection. Are you going to bring Joseph into the picture, Hubert or Adeoti?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, let me express my gratitude to the Professor Aina for such a very, very illustrative and very, very informative and educational, I must say, his work. I wish I could have laid my hands on the paper to read myself, to be able to digest this, and also for the discussants, for the eloquence in which they described it. But let me introduce myself first, maybe if you're wondering. My name is Joseph Atamensa, as you've seen it. I am a colleague of Peter at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. where we all, well, in case, let me be straight. When I got there, he had just left, but I saw him subsequently, and we became friends, and we became like brothers. So I'm just here because I think I just want to honor him. And it's right that the topic that has been chosen is something which is right for him because of the way Peter is. And I must say that he is an intellectual, and I'll say he's an academician too, because he always would have a new book or something that he would want to refer you to read, and always is engaging, and it's always thinking about development and how our nations can be better. So in that respect, that's why I have come here. Now, to the question I have for Prof, which when you talk about kindness, and compassion, and empathy, which are ingredients for leadership, I kind of agree with you, but again, it puts us on a very slippery slope. I come from Ghana, and I don't know about, I've been to Nigeria a number of times, but I can say that both countries, the people are the same people. They have one father, but two different mothers. But, so when you have a religion in Ghana, you realize that there are so many churches in Ghana. And at the same time, you have so many churches, I'm told, in Nigeria. And the question which strikes me in terms of when you give such a seminar in terms of kindness, does it mean that, you're trying to bring in religion into leadership? Because I find that a lot of our leaders tend to have spiritual leaders, and they go to them for prayers, they go to church and all those things. And so is that where we are getting to in terms of giving a role to the church? But at the same time, we know that we need to have separation of the churches. The second thing which I wanted to know, I know that the moderator was talking about neoliberalism, maybe referring to a question that had been posed. Neoliberalism and whether it's compatible with kindness. I would argue that no. I mean, I think that kindness can be whether you are neoliberal or whether you are progressive. The question of kindness comes in the forms of genuinely being concerned about the country. That's why you lead, and you lead because you want to better the lives of the people you serve. And so I think we should not try and make it an ideological question, but rather every sense of leadership is needed in that sense. So Prof, please, could you help in terms of your discussion, the role of the Bible or the whatever, the Quran or whatever one reads, and leadership in terms of political leadership, and whether it is consistent or we are moving into a state where one would say that religion is also should be, you need only religious people to be our leaders, and because they are the ones who could all espouse kindness. And by the way, what's the definition of kindness? What is the definition of kindness and empathy and compassion? What's your definition? Is it from the biblical point of view? Is it something which, like our grandparents passed it on to us? Be kind to someone, be kind. But everyone will have a definition of kindness. Sorry that I've been too long, but let me end by thanking the organizers for honoring the memory of my brother and friend. You know that we also, Ghanaians also claim Peter because of his connection to the continent, to the continent, but to Ghana. We also claim him as one of us. So he's also my brother. I thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me thank you. You have complicated the conversation nicely. So you have given us room to debate in the short period that we have. And I want to thank you for that. What I had said, what I think Eka said was, what will neoliberalism and kindness say to each other? And you helped us along on that issue, raising some philosophical questions here. And I'm also not sure whether I heard Professor Aina talk about religion at all. So it's good to see how people hear things and to see the slant you have put there, and you have raised some very cogent questions there with some of, with this big title, this big assumption. Does that mean that you're trying to bring religion into leadership? Thank you for that. I'm minding the time a little bit, but I'm also minded to bring, is it Alexander da Costa that has his hand up? I think it's you. If you want to come into that conversation for 2 minutes, please, I want to hand over to Professor Aina and my colleagues who discussed to try to close us off with comments. Thank you. Is that Alex? Did I see your hand up?
Yes, thank you very much, Fumi. Just a very quick intervention, and sorry to, I think my interest in this subject matter is without doubt very passionate. The third question is the question that strikes me as a very important question. Given the fact that at the UN in Geneva, where of course the World Health Organization is held, is hosted, and also given the fact that WHO have the lead on the pandemic as the UN agency for that, there have been very important discussions. And I remember taking the floor in our, because I take care of health matters for the Gambia. And therefore, once we have our meetings with WHO, regular meetings where we attend as experts or representatives of our various countries, we've had this discussion, and this discussion about vaccine inequality is extremely important. I believe there's a role for the African Leadership Center to liaise with the African group in Geneva. And the African group is made up of all the African countries who are members of the AU. So the African group in Geneva is coordinated by the representation of the AU head diplomat designated in Geneva. Now, it's important that we do take some action on this inequality of vaccine. And the word kindness there in that question is very important. I think it's important that the rest of the world look to Africa with a kind heart and with a humane approach. Probably humane approach is better than using the word kind. But it's important also that amongst ourselves as Africans, right, we begin to disseminate and to show that we have kindness amongst ourselves, which I think is lacking. Maybe not in reality, but in terms of how it's manifested, how it's communicated, how it's portrayed to the rest of the world. Because there's this pitiful approach to the African continent, when it comes to things like vaccines. We will stock up a lot of vaccines. We will make sure that there's no vaccine inequality. This was the message that we were getting before the pandemic exploded. And after the pandemic exploded, we found out two great things. First and foremost, the anticipation that the African continent would be devastated by COVID didn't happen. Secondly, the promise, and at these sort of forums, you take the floor and you speak passionately about these things with the knowledge that things may not happen. But in the long run, what happens is that people tell you that they're going to make sure that there is vaccine equality, and we end up not having it. And this is exactly what happened. So for me, this is a pointer. And I think since we're having a discussion, about being humane, and so we must not take humane and kindness for granted and expect it to be showered on us as Africans. I think it's time that we work towards earning this and advocating for it. Yes, we don't have the means, but yes, we should also push to ensure that responsible governments within our continent begin to take the leadership role to ensure that we do begin to produce vaccines, and we say we want to produce vaccines, and we ask to produce our own vaccines, rather than relying on charity and kindness, which is not always forthcoming. So I think it's an important point. I'm sure Prof. Aina is going to answer that question, but in answering the question, Prof, I just wanted to draw to your attention that this is a hot topic at the UN in Geneva, you know, amongst health experts, African health experts. And perhaps this is the time for organizations like the ALC and similar to engage more with the AU in Geneva and ensure that Africa does have a common position and a collective position on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Amazing. I think we've closed the loop. We've seen in practice at the level of states or interstate relations. We've talked at interpersonal, level and institutional level, which is what the lecture covered well. But thank you, and this has been well complicated by the introduction of other disciplines and themes to it, and which talks about the complexity of leadership itself and the ways in which it can be perceived, and so on. I hand over to you, Professor Aina. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating. I think Chidi responded effectively in his comments around the issue of why be kind, why be compassionate, why be empathetic. And he reduced it in a very interesting way. It goes back to the political economy of the classicals, the original classicals and neoclassicals, in terms of the importance of self-interest. Adam Smith, Alfred Marshall. This is the basis, the foundational basis of contemporary capitalism. It's always about self-interest, and then the invisible hand will solve it. It also goes back to the foundation, the philosophical foundation of Western states theory, John Locke and Hobbes and the rest of them, around why is there a social contract. Again, it comes to preventing the war of all against war or all. So it's very clear there in terms of Western thought and Western epistemology. And that is tied to the problems we are facing today. It's tied, and we are having this conversation in English. We are suffering an epistemic entrapment. We are thinking within the confines of theories of knowledge, ways of seeing and ways of speaking that have been defined for us by the colonial experience. But I think there's a dialectics there, because it does not make us prisoners. The coming together, the tension there, the recognition of our capacities as human beings to continuously evolve and try to build a better world makes us escape this trap. And our capacities to have our reason also makes us to escape this trap. So that's one point in terms of how do we understand what we are understanding. So I think it's always a basic point in terms of methodology, and I'm glad you kept it. And that takes me very quickly to the feminists, the question about feminist virtues, the question about religion and theology. You must situate all of this in the context of the evolution of patriarchy, patriarchal theologies, theocracies that were built on monotheism. Monotheism was the arc development of patriarchy, in which there was one powerful, overwhelming deity that was all male, and therefore gave only secondary position to the female deity. So there's a whole question. This is fascinating because this conversation has exposed, and we need to spend some time. First, this also leads us to, how do we demystify knowledge? How do we demystify assertions? Mr. Mensah, you were talking about is this Christianity and Islam, and is this religion, and the separation between church and state. All of that is mythology. The fundamental assumptions of state creation, state foundation, is essentially related to religion from which the societies emerged. And religion is only embodied. There's a spiritual aspect of religion, but there is a particular solidarity aspect of religion that defines the nature of your being, your ontology. And that is where the definition of your reality comes from in a very significant way. So the virtues that we find that hold societies together and found and are primordial virtues and are found in all societies, like Chidi and Eka said. Eka took us to poetry, to the humanizing aspect of poetry. All those virtues are clearly embedded in every society. Every society has its own God. And like Durkheim said, God is society, society is God, from which our values come. So that is one point from the perspective of my training and my old engagement in the classroom as a sociologist and looking at the origins of values and all of that. So religion is not separate from this, but it's not religion as church, because church or mosque do not embody these humane virtues that we're talking about. They have actually become material constructs of empires. You remember the slavery was blessed by the church. And slavery was one of the most cruel manifestations of human beings. Well, I would say man to others. I'm using a intentionally feminist twist there. The most cruel manifestation, chattel slavery. And it came from, and you can see there was the Arab chattel slavery and there was the Atlantic chattel slavery. So both of them had this basis there. And that was one of the most cruel manifestation of engagement. So I'll leave, and then genocide, the cleansing of people. When you even talk about Bible, so you kill all the people, their cows, their goats, and you sow their soil with salt. Again, excuse me, there's cruelty there. There is cruelty there, not just these virtues or values of kindness. So I'm not surprised when people can take many things from our sacred texts, because our sacred text is the embodiment of the totality of our existence. So I'll leave that. I don't want to get into that because it's a very sensitive point for me. And I do not believe in a lot of the noise that is made today by the leaders of religion, except that I think they should role model what they stand for in terms of compassion, in terms of empathy, in terms of kindness, not through the building of massive churches or movements that really lead to nothing but the growth of material presence and numbers. Now, I want to come back to, so the one about the modeling kindness, compassion, and empathy as feminist virtues, I think that's true. But I think we need to, the point I made about movement building, there's a lot to learn from the feminist movement, but there's a lot that we should also learn from the feminist movement in terms of humaneness, because occasionally when the feminist movement fights the rest of the world, it uses the weapons of patriarchy. It comes with the weapons of verbal violence. It comes because it's been the subject of attack and hostility. So I think that's one of the points. If we take what the feminist movement has in terms of its humanistic modeling, then there's a lot for us to learn. And I think that's an important aspect. In fact, my talk and my thinking were actually really, really influenced by the feminist movement itself. We've been talking about resilience and COVID-19. And again, we need, like Chidi said, we need these three virtues for our very survival. The evolution of humankind. If you look at all the beings, we are the ones with the most vulnerable babies. If there's no compassion, there's no empathy, there's no kindness, there's no taking care of babies by the group, by mothers, the sacrifice mothers give for a child to be able to take care of themselves. All of those are the things that determine our evolutionary success. Look, if an elephant gives birth or a giraffe gives birth, I think within 4 days, those children, those offspring can take care of themselves. The human child cannot take care of themselves for almost 7, 8 years. You need a community of solidarity, a community of empathy to deal with that. So our survival and our self-interest is based on these virtues. Now, on vaccine inequality, I am very, very privileged to be part of an institution that has actually contributed a leadership to what one might call vaccine emancipation. The MasterCard Foundation gave his biggest grant ever of $1.3 billion to the African CDC for the development of an African vaccine and for bringing together through the work of people like the president of South Africa, the president of Senegal, and the president of Rwanda, along with the AU Commission. And I refer to Your Excellency, Alexander da Costa, that this work is going on the continent. The continent is working. 3 countries are going to be centers for independent vaccine development. The Pasteur Institute in Dakar, Senegal, has the capacity. In Africa, we have the intellectual capacity. What we are fighting now is the intellectual property, the IP regime that has actually made the fact of this. In Nigeria, in Kenya, in South Africa, the gene sequencing for the COVID virus was done in time. So it's not about capacity, it's about mobilizing those resources, putting the people. So we are not in a conversation of pleading, of beggary at this moment. We have transcended that. The continent has moved beyond that. The continent is reorganizing around the reclaiming its capacity to produce and ready to engage the world from the point of view of the debates and the struggles which we have with the intellectual property regimes. So that's a lot of work is going on in the AU. A lot of work is going on in your old Institutional Economic Commission for Africa. A lot of work is going on in the African CDC. There's the COVAX, there's the African Vaccine Initiative. There are lots of initiatives that are going on. So Africans are working. Maybe we are behind time because of the resources, and we are behind time because we were blocked. We were blocked because we abide by the global conventions and rules. Some of the other countries in terms of pharmaceuticals and medical manufacturing break all the patents rules, they break all the intellectual property rules, because anything about health is about humanity and is about collective civilization. So I have my own feeling about intellectual property around that. I'll leave the conversation to my colleagues in the panel, but I think kindness, compassion, and empathy are going to have to come back because they are in our interest, collective and individual interest. They are in our interest in terms of addressing the problems we face in our societies, the problems of violence, the problems of despair, the problems of exclusion, the remobilization of our young people into militants. That's why the African Leadership Center came into it, into militias and militants and all of that, when they could be, and they are productive and active citizens of our society. So I think this is a long story. I think you have opened up the conversation. I think I'll say to the fellows and to the scholars, many, many, many books, articles, and points of interventions, platforms of interventions can be created from the conversations we've had today. So I'll say over to you all, because this is what today is. It is Peter da Costa's memorial gift to us to go forth, to think differently, to act differently, to mobilize differently, and then to build movements and connect differently. Thank you.
Wow, I have had messages coming, Prof. So you say the intergenerational and interdisciplinary and intersectoral dialogue that has gone on here. What is clear to me in terms of the messages that are coming in is the essence, is that we have the very essence, the very core of the African-led ideas of change that the ALC is about. So this professor of professors, as you were professing, going into all of the philosophical foundations of the Western political theories, I'm getting messages here to say, how long will it take us to be like this? And I'm saying to my colleagues, it's a journey. And that's why this space exists. I no longer, I mean, I think we should leave it at that and not, Eka and Chidi, you added such great value to this conversation by bringing in particular dimensions and dynamics, but the ways in which you have just answered this question confirms the you know, what I could not say eloquently about you when I introduced you earlier, Prof. You have taken, you know, theory building, knowledge production, its application, but actually its integration, all right, into our beings, into our ways of being as Africans, you know, who are first and foremost, you know, people who are trying to coexist in an interdependent world, is what you have taught us briefly this afternoon. You have opened a chapter, and scholarship on this actually has to be turned on its head. And I think that's why the ALC space is a place where these fellows and students who are listening are going to be creating and producing knowledge for some time to come. So I would, in a sense, like to wrap this up by just closing with some of the, it's unfortunate this person is not okay, she's put her name there. But let me start with Fumi Vogt, who says this has been such a great lecture and very befitting for Peter, and says thank you to you. I've been reflecting on the concept of kindness in practice in our institutions. How do we move some of these concepts into practice to build stronger, better institutions? Well, the comment I would like to close with is that, as a matter of fact, here's how I would do it. It's in two parts. One from Karen and one from Sarah Lucas. Thanks so much. This is Karen. Thanks so much for this event and for bringing us together to remember Peter. He was really instrumental in shaping the data for development community here in Kenya and Africa at large. He knew how to connect people together and to see opportunities in unlikely places. He made time to be present. May he continue resting. Thank you so much. This is from Karen. And I close completely with Sarah Lucas, who worked very closely with Peter up until the last moment. I think, Professor, I know you know this as well, at the Hewlett Foundation. And she's actually, as Shuvai will close us, we'll offer announcements before we close. You would see that the motivation behind the support for this lecture series has come, you know, from the support that Sarah Lucas facilitated with her colleagues at Hewlett. She says, wow, this deep connection between transcendent intellectualism and humanness is so beautiful and so befitting of Peter's legacy. It is an honor to be part of this discussion. Thank you, everyone, for your work to plan it. I think that's a very apt way to close what has been an amazing conversation and which is due to continue. So typical of Peter, that legacy continues in that way. Prof, I cannot thank you enough. Thank you for always really being a source of motivation, an intellectual, what do you call it? You add to our intellectual curiosity and to our aspirations to be better intellectuals and better people. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I will now call on Shuvai to make a brief announcement before closing us. Please give us 5 more minutes. We will make sure that we close very quickly. Thank you. Shuvai, over to you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Fumi, and really thank you so very much to Professor Aina, to Chidi, to Eka, to everyone who has spoken today. But Prof. Aina, I for one will be listening on repeat to this lecture for the next 6 weeks, just so I can, you know, wrap my head around the very fascinating, very thought-provoking, very stimulating lecture that you've given us today, and also the challenge that you have laid down for the African Leadership Center around how we think and conceptualize about leadership, but also how we live it out, and how all those who leave the African Leadership Center to go and do the very things that they set out to do from the onset, how they think about those things. And so thank you so very much. I'll just take a few minutes to give some updates on the Peter da Costa legacy projects at the ALC. Last year, at the first Peter da Costa Memorial Lecture on the 18th of August 2020, we signaled our intention to honor Peter's legacy through dedication to scholarship on the highest standards of evidence gathering for recruiting and producing change-making Africans of the next generation. In addition to its decision to establish the Peter da Costa Memorial Lecture as an annual event, the ALC Board of Trustees also took a decision last year to establish doctoral and postdoctoral fellowships named after Peter da Costa. to honor his contribution to the development of the very idea of projecting excellent African knowledge and communicating research findings for policy influence and uptake. Peter da Costa Fellows will be expected to gather and preserve new forms of data and communicate research through new technologies as an integral part of their work. Finally, the board agreed to support the publication of Peter da Costa's PhD thesis titled Rule of Experts, Decomposing Agency and Agendas in Africa's Development Regime, which will be done with the permission of his family. I'm delighted to report that we've made some progress toward realizing some of these ambitions. This is in large part because of the support from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, who generously donated $100,000 over 3 years to the Peter da Costa Legacy projects, including the annual memorial lectures, and towards initiating and launching the Peter da Costa Fellowship. So thank you so very much to the Hewlett Foundation. While the disruptions of COVID have meant that we retained the virtual format of this year's lecture, we are hopeful that we will have next year's lecture in our ALC space in Nairobi, while maintaining the possibility of online participation for those who cannot be there in person. Although we had identified and approached some of Peter's colleagues and friends to participate with ALC colleagues in an advisory committee for the memorial lectures, we hope to have the inaugural meeting of this committee in the course of this academic term that has just begun. We have also developed terms of reference and a set of criteria for the selection of the Peter da Costa postdoctoral fellowships at the ALC. On this basis, we have invited recent ALC PhD graduates to apply for a combination of residential and non-residential fellowships, and we expect the first fellows to be in place by January 2022. The residential fellowships will be supported by funding from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, as well as the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. At the time of Peter's passing in August 2020, the ALC was in the process of conducting a mid-generation review which would guide its future work. Peter da Costa's ideas on data generation and communication are at the core of this ongoing review process, and we hope to soon begin to share with you some of the findings and outcomes of this very, very exciting intergenerational research project. So with that, I would like to hand over to Professor Karuti Kanyinga, a member of the Board of Trustees of the ALC, to give us a vote of thanks and to close our time together today. Thank you so much, Prof.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shuvai. I don't know where to begin because this is not an event to close all of a sudden, and therefore I seek indulgence of everyone because Tade is not someone to thank just by saying thank you very much, Tande, and then you go. We've learned a lot, and he's indeed said that this is a memory gift, memory of a gift that Peter da Costa gave us. And if you look at the conversation that we have had throughout the evening, it speaks a lot about what Peter himself was about. Tande has spoken much about that, and I think let's me also start emphasizing, as Augustus said, Chindi is the one who has now been naming people here Augustus. Those of you who didn't know that Tade has been a mentor to many of us, I included, actually very, very early in the late 1980s, if I can say that. You forgot to mention that he was in Codestrio. You said that I didn't remember. You did. That was his actually main roots. Tande today is one of the practicing academics. We called, he's just coined a phrase that is now used widely, and paracademics. He's one of our greatest paracademics in the continent. And for obvious reasons, as you can see, he connects theory to practice and builds practice into theory to speak a lot about Africa's knowledge conditions. Peter was always alive to the fact that we need to decolonize the language. The language of communication, the language of teaching, and the language of practice were very central to Peter's work everywhere. And indeed, as you can see from Tade, the concept of empathy, compassion, and kindness are a real African community language, as opposed to the Western thinking of humanitarianism. Massive, a lot of work is being produced in the West today, as if humanitarianism is a new concept in the African context. But as we have known, and as we have known in the whole language of decolonization, labeling matters a lot. Those who label with a purpose. And they label it humanitarianism, and of course, attempt to make us think that giving is new. And those of you who are not familiar with the Tande's work on giving to help and helping to give, please look at that text. It's going to be, look at in particular, the introductory chapter. I'm mentioning this because these are also foundations of empathy, compassion, and kindness. I love what Chindi said that, I mean, when you empathize with people, that's what is going to be your shield. And compassion will always protect you. And empathy is what will attack people. And I think those are very significant ones really to mention. Again, thank you very much, Chindi. Chindi will always say something that is memorable. And I'm glad that actually our scholars have come of age, Tande. Eka, I don't know what we should do, but you know, of course, we know how to thank you. You have come of age. You are another Oga sister now, if I can say that. That's your name now from now onwards. And I think we thank you very much for that. Let me also thank my boss now, Gladwell. I don't know whether Gladwell or Tieno is my boss, of course, but I would like to take this opportunity because were it not for Gladwell's insistence, we would not be going this far. We started insisting as a board that we need to be doing something for Peter. And sure, indeed, we have traveled this journey. There is another step that, Shubai didn't remember to mention. We were thinking actually of even having working paper series by some of our younger scholars who will do work that is synonymous with what Peter was doing. But these are things that are work in progress in order to keep memory of Peter with us and for as many years as possible. But let me just say what a memorable occasion to have Peter's family with us. From last year, but one, we've always had the family and we have lived together as one, remembering to remember. And I think there is no other better way of saying it is good that we have a family that we can be always supporting and be speaking to on almost all occasions. Mine is only to say, Fumi, thank you very much for this particular occasion, your moderation, Shuvai, another Oga sister. No, she is another Ogan daughter, not sister this time. And to say we look forward to meeting again next year. Your Excellency, Alexander da Costa, please pass our regards to your family. But let me also end up by saying that what Tanda has spoken about inequalities, in global inequalities, I think is worth another topic, is worth another seminar. And if we can move with speed, I think I don't mind saying IDS and the ALC can organize this particular event to come and speak about global inequalities, especially during the crisis of pandemic. That would be a very, very important journey to walk. Tande, please do not hesitate to when we call you upon. Now, let me mention that Tande is one of the few minds in the continent that we call almost every other time. For big continental occasions, for big continental events, we call upon Tande, the big Oga, to come and say a word because we know he speaks as a paracademic, where practice and theory matches in order for the younger generation to learn from. It's my hope that the younger generation that I've seen here are learning a lot, and very soon we shall be seeing them producing papers that actually move out of this epistemic entrapment that we are in, simply because the labeling is made by others. Mine is to say, thank you very much again, Tade. Thank you very much, Chidi. Eka, Oga sister, Ogandota also. Thank you very much, Fumi, Gladwell, Shuvai, and everybody else. But most importantly, of course, Alexander da Costa and family. In Kenya, we say asanteni sana. Those are very few ones that mean a lot, mean a lot. And if you hear a person telling you asante sana, it's coming from the bottom of the heart. Thank you very much, asanteni.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you so very much. So with that, we will say goodbye, and until next year for the Peter da Costa Memorial Lecture 2022, we look forward to seeing you then, but also in between. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You.